So, hello everybody. We're here with Dr. Bernd Würsig. Bernd is one of the very knowledgeable marine mammal scientists for a long time. Was a professor at Texas A&M Galveston. Has been working with marine mammals for 40 years or more. Has published a lot of papers and scientific articles, more than 200 altogether. It's been president of the Marine Mammal Society, won several awards, and had more than 70 students, direct students, and is the person that has been involved in the research and the development of photo ID for marine mammals, theodolite tracking, and bubble curtains, right, Bert?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Bubble net curtains are being used quite a bit in order to reduce especially intensive seismic type of and percussive hammering for building things type of sounds underwater, and I'm delighted to see that. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So obviously the photo ID work. I mean, do you want to explain a little bit how did you come across that? I know that Roger Payne and Michael Biggs were also at the very early stage of the photo ID methodology for marine mammals. Do you want to tell us about that a little bit?
Sure, I'd be happy to. You know, as an old guy, I love to reminisce and make up stories. You're so right. You're so right. Roger Payne first started identifying southern right whales, Eubalaena australis, from the callosity patterns, those spots and bumps that are keratin structures on the heads of right whales, and every individual whale has it's like a fingerprint, has a different set of these bumps, of these callosities they are called, and he got into the idea. It was really his idea of systematically photographing the animals from cliffs, from boats, but we had only small boats while we were out there in the early 1970s. And I was one of his assistants, and from airplanes. And of course, that kind of photo identification of large whales has taken off wonderfully, tremendously, and it turns out that with good enough photography, you don't need callosity patterns. You can identify any whale by particular marks and splatches on their bodies, but tails have been used very much for identification of especially creatures such as humpback whales and sperm whales, because they all have slightly different tail markings. So Roger Payne did indeed start this for large whales in the early 1970s with southern right whales, and then for humpback whales in Hawaii and several other areas of the world, the Azores, for example, the Canaries, and other places. The Biggs, Michael Biggs, you mentioned, for identifying killer whales or orca from their beautiful dorsal fins, but especially from the markings underneath their dorsal fins and around their eyes. Every killer whale, every orca has what's called an eye spot above its eye. And those vary by different societies, by different populations, but they also vary by individual. And Michael Biggs and several others started in the late 1960s, actually, slightly before Roger Payne was doing his work with large whales, started identifying these orca by their splotch patterns, by their markings, by their the type of indentations or scratch marks in their dorsal fins. And at the same time, Roger and his then wife, Katie Payne, And we together recognized that you could identify bottlenose dolphins by the trailing edges of their dorsal fins. And that wasn't terribly excitingly new. That had been done with amazingly well-marked animals, unofficially, sort of, often with not photographs, but with drawings of several species of dolphins, mainly bottlenose dolphins, Tursiops truncatus. Back in the 1930s, even there are publications of particularly white-marked animals and those with very deformed dorsal fins. But of course, with proper detailed photography, we started recognizing in the early 1970s that indeed every animal, except for maybe a newborn calf, every animal can be identified as an individual. And that had been done so wonderfully on land by George Schaller with mountain gorillas, by Jane Goodall with chimpanzees, individual identification from subtle little marks on the noses and such. And that kind of work had also started in the late 50s and early 60s, only about 10 to 15 years before the marine mammal work. So this kind of recognition of individuals, of course, opened up the world of behavior, of behavioral ecology. As soon as you know who's doing what and who's doing what with whom, then you can start really describing the society. So it did open up a lot. And we were simply fortunate, I think, Melany, my wife Melany, and I were simply fortunate to be young and in the right place, sort of at the right time, while that kind of work with animals and nature was blossoming. It was, I get goosebumps talking about it. It was kind of an exciting time. Yeah, it's still an exciting time, and again an exciting time. We have the drones now that give us so much better information. Oh my goodness, I wish I were young again, and could really take proper advantage of that. But indeed, it was exciting then too.
Right. Do you want to tell us the challenge that happened at that time? Because obviously you were using film at that time. So do you want to, it's very different from what we use nowadays, all the digital. And today we come home with like 10 gigas after a day out in the field. So how was it, all those, the process?
Yeah, it was indeed challenging. We were fortunate to be funded. It wasn't big funding, I might tell you, but to be funded enough to eat and to get free film. We were funded by the U.S. National Geographic Society. And so they gave us color film and as much as we wanted. But back when we started out in 1972, the common speed of color film what is now called ISO 8, and for each doubling of the ISO, the film has a capability of accepting twice as much light. Okay, or put another way, it can, if you have an ISO of 8, then you need quite a bit of light in order to take a picture with, let's say, your lens all the way open, your f-stop all the way open, and maybe at a speed of 1/25th of a second, which is not very fast when you consider animals moving, right? Mm-hmm. If you have that ISO of 8, and then you go to double that, an ISO of 16, well, then you can take the picture at twice that speed instead of 125th of a second at 250th of a second, right? Okay. And you therefore get an easier picture. Well, we started with ISO of 8, and the common settings these days for you good folks who are taking semi-pro cameras out into the field, you'll set the ISO to 400 maybe, right? Yeah. And that'll be 8, 16, 32, 64, right? 125 essentially, 250, and then another stop and a half, we call it, to 400. So each time you need less light Or with the same amount of light, you can increase your depth of field, your f-stop, or you can increase your speed, right?
Right.
So back then, an ISO of 8, we started out with, yes, that was a challenge, especially with long lenses, right?
Yes.
That would not have an f-stop opening of 2.8 or 2.0, but instead an f-stop opening of 5.6, something like that. So you really, really had to be on a tripod, as steady as possible, with as much speed as possible so as not to blur the image, and probably your f-stop had to be quite open so you didn't have very much depth of field. The point is, yes, it was a challenge to have film speed that was not very rapid.
Yeah,
and then we went from ISO of 8 in about a year or so to 25. Oh my goodness, that was 2.5 times more speed of film, we call it, and that helped one heck of a lot.
Right.
And then, of course, we had a rapid increase. There was Ektachrome 64 that came on, and several other Fujichrome and several other other types of films came out. Then 125 and so forth.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah,
we did work in color a lot, but of course you don't really need color for identifying bottlenose dolphins or for identifying southern right whales. Black and white is just fine. And black and white film back then had much greater speed. So we used a lot of various types of Kodak and other films. And sometimes we what's called push the films in order to change the ISO from something like 125 or 250 to 1,000 or so. So we would get more speed. Every time you increase that light capability, gathering capability of the film, you increase the grain size as well. So that's a problem. You don't want to get too large, but you do increase the grain size. But black and white was very, very important to us back then, because the color results we could not see until somebody went back to the States, and they were developed in National Geographic's Kodak laboratories, and then came back as slides. But we wouldn't see them until we got back to the States a year later, a year and a half later. So we did not have feedback like today.
Yeah.
A way to get feedback was to use black and white. And I built my own darkroom down in Argentina. It's kind of nice. I've 3 times in my life built a chemical darkroom. And because I'm a very short person, I was able to build the tabletops, the lab tops for the various baths and such that need to be done in a wet lab to my height. It was wonderful. And everybody else had to stoop down like this, in order to work. But built my own darkroom and built my own a diffusion type of enlarger with the lens from the camera. So I'd go out and take pictures and then put the lens of the camera into this box that I'd made, and be able to take a negative that you developed very quickly, right after you got back from the field. You could do that night. Take the negative and project it and make pictures out of those. So we did have feedback. We had feedback as quickly as possible. During bad weather days, I'd spend all my time in the darkroom, and thank goodness we had feedback, because things would go wrong, like a lens was not focusing properly, or I didn't have enough experience and was taking the pictures at too slow a speed, that kind of thing. So that kind of feedback wasn't as good as feedback these days, but at least it saved the day.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's
Well, it was just the way it was, you know, and everybody else. I'm sure. If Michael Big were still around, which he is not, unfortunately, he would tell similar stories, and certainly the various people who started working with right whales, humpback whales, and other animals had black and white. If they didn't do their own developing, they had close by laboratories that would give them feedback rather quickly. Now, back then, of course, you had a film canister that went into the camera, and that had 36 shots in it, didn't it? That had 36 frames in it. We rolled our own film and we pushed it a little bit. We got up to 39 frames out of a canister, but that was it. Roger Payne, for the airplane work, had a special adaptation type of back for his Nikon that would take 250 frames. And that was nice. It was heavy, but it was so much nicer than to every 36 frames have to rewind the film back into the canister, open up the back of the camera, put a new one in, wind it properly, and start it again. So that was a disadvantage. We didn't know it was a disadvantage because there was no other technique, right?
Right.
But relative to today, where of course you can take a lot of pictures very quickly. Since I grew up in that analog photography world, with those constraints and with dark rooms to deal with, and with long periods of time for color photos to come back to deal with, I still have, I think, a different, and I'm sure I'm not the only oldster like that, a different view of taking pictures. I get a little internally upset when I hear a younger colleague beside me go click, 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 click. I think, no, go click, click. Wait for the best opportunity and take 2 or 5 pictures, but not 100.
Yeah.
But that's simply an internal old person psychological problem.
Do you still have your old camera, like the one you started with?
I do indeed, yes. In New Zealand, where we have a laboratory and where we spend, Melany and I spend some of our time still. I have a museum of the old cameras and old videos, going from the large beta format to VHS format to then what's called 8 video, and then high 8 video, and then digital tape video, and now of course it all streams into a little memory stick. So we've got all those cameras, and some of them are still working beautifully as museum pieces. Yes.
Right. Okay, so yeah, definitely very interesting to hear the beginning of the photo ID and the challenge that you guys had when photographing marine mammals.
You know, it was very exciting. Can I say one more quick thing here?
Of course.
In the late, we knew because we knew video was advancing so nicely. We knew that pretty soon we would get at least rudimentary still cameras that would probably be not quite as good as the resolution obtained in a let's say 125 ISO Kodachrome. We knew that it was getting there, or going to get there pretty soon. And then several cameras came out very quickly in the mid to late 1990s, and we snapped up the very first good one. It was called an Nikon Coolpix, and it was very primitive compared to what's available now. And my former student, Tim Markowitz, first tested that and did beautiful work with dusky dolphins and wrote a paper for Marine Mammal Science on the availability and the usefulness of this new technique. And he wasn't the only one, or we weren't the only ones starting that. Indeed, a lot of people out in nature were starting to get into digital photography. And it was at that time not quite as good as the resolution in analog. And then, of course, it moved very rapidly and now has surpassed the resolution of analog by just about any measures, although the latitude of analog film for artistic purposes can still be, you know, I wouldn't want to argue with anybody, can still be more attractive than the capability of digital. But it happened in the late 1990s, and we were fortunate enough to get right into that. And I was by that time, of course, an expert in analog darkroom work, so I could do lots of things in the darkroom. And I so quickly got into and really enjoyed it, and I don't need to get my fingers wet anymore with chemicals. Really enjoyed working with especially Adobe Photoshop Pro, where you can do so much with pictures so rapidly. And that doesn't mean faking a picture. It just means getting the best possible definition out of it once you've taken the picture.
Right, right. No, amazing.
Okay, shut up on that topic.
No, that's okay. And I mean, obviously the photo ID, it's a non-invasive technique, an amazing technique that we use every day. Basically, all the people that go out in the field use it daily. But maybe now you can tell us a little bit about another non-invasive technique, the theodolite tracking. So a lot of people sometimes are not so familiarized with theodolites work.
Yeah, and I know you know this, but I do have a comment on the non-invasive. It is non-invasive if you take the pictures from way up high, let's say from a drone flying high, or from an airplane, and I've done lots of work from circling aircraft up in the Arctic, and non-invasive if you're doing it from shore. But if you're out on a boat, you're out on a boat, and it depends on how the animals react to your vessel. Sometimes they don't react. Sometimes I think quite often they seem like they don't react, but they're really reacting, either positively or negatively, or even more confusingly, some of the same group positively and others negatively. So it can certainly change the movement patterns, the behaviors, the structure of the society, the physical structure of the society, by a boat being present. So we have to be careful, even with non-invasive, and I agree, relatively non-invasive photography and behavioral observations from close by, we can be changing behavior of animals. And we have some data on that, as others do too, of looking at the movement patterns of animals when the boat is present and when the boat isn't present. And that gets us to your question about theodolites, because theodolites can only most efficiently best be used from shore, from cliffs or structures on shore. We've done quite a bit of in Galveston Island, which is it's a city, human intensive. We've done hotel hopping by taking a theodolite up onto the 22nd floor, going up in a lift, setting it up, following a group of bottlenose dolphins passing by, and then going down, getting into the car, driving another kilometer, going up on the next high rise, and doing the same thing. So from shore, with a surveyor's transit, which is really it's a fancy device, but these days is both mechanical and physical. If you know your exact height and you have some kind of a zero reference point, in the horizontal world, then you know these days exactly where you are by GPS measurement. Then you can say, I know my height, I know the tide height going up and down. I need to incorporate that because I need my height very, very accurate. I point that theodolite, it gives me an angle of inclination, and it gives me an angle of movement sideways. Then if I have all of that, I can say precisely where an object is, where a boat is, where a whale is, where a boat approaching is or leaving is, as long as I point right at the surface of where that object is, right at the surface, and therefore I have that height and I have those angles. And so these days, in real time, while you're out there with a theodolite on a cliff or on a house, you can get very accurate position information. And if you get accurate position information, you can get speeds of travel. You can get orientations and reorientations and changes in speeds of travel as a boat approaches, for example. You can get very, very detailed data. And those are the kind of things we've done with boats being nearby, including our own vessels. And we know from theodolite tracking positional changes that, yes, even we can disturb the animals if we're not careful.
Sure. I mean, if
one more thing about that, I guess. I've sort of basically waved my hands and described theodolite tracking using a surveyor's transit. It was the lovely and bright Roger Payne who first got that idea. Actually, somebody, a surveying friend, said, "Hey, try this," and then he used it appropriately and developed it, and started getting positional information of right whales, and we of course adapted it very quickly to dusky dolphins and to bottlenose dolphins in Argentina, and then with considerable luck, a colleague, friend of mine, a graduate student at Stony Brook University, Jan Volitsky, wrote the first beautiful theodolite tracking program that it turns out everybody else's is based on, even though it's become so sophisticated since those 1970s days. He developed a sequential algorithm system of using the curvature of the Earth, a knowledge of the curvature of the Earth, in order to approximate, getting closer and closer by iterations of greater than 10,000 numbers, getting closer and closer to the actual position of where that mark on the water is. And if we had a straight Earth, if we weren't curving down, we wouldn't have had to do that. But he developed that one bright night, and that algorithm, it turns out, is, I think, in probably all theodolite tracking programs these days.
That's excellent, excellent. So Bernard, you mentioned that obviously you've been doing this all over the world. You mentioned Argentina, New Zealand, Texas. So where else have you been working?
Let's see, you mentioned we started out in Argentina with dusky and bottlenose dolphins. And then for my postdoc, I worked with Ken Norris, the wonderful Kenneth S. Norris, in Hawaii on Hawaiian spinner dolphins. And we did indeed both photography and theodolite tracking from a cliff in Kealakekua Bay on the Kona, or western lee side of the Big Island of Hawaii. We were there for several years, and yes, Melany and I were in charge of the photography and the theodolite tracking. But wonderful Randall Wells was doing his PhD with Ken Norris, and he was in charge of so much. He was the captain of the boat, and he really knew how to organize projects, and that was wonderful. We did some radio tracking as well that we had done, with larger, cumbersome radios that I'm not proud of back with dusky dolphins in Argentina. But by Hawaii time, 10 years later, we had tiny little radios that are no smaller now, as a matter of fact, that we were putting onto spinner dolphins, and those worked very, very well. We tracked a lot of spinner dolphins by radio tracking, by theodolite tracking, by photo identification, by work underwater and videotaping underwater, and for the first time, I think, with these dolphins, and by behavioral work. Yeah, so that was a good project in Hawaii for several years, and we wrote a book from that. Ken Norris is the senior author of it, and Randy and Mel and I are co-authors, and it's called The Hawaiian Spinner Dolphin, in 1994. But after, well, already in 1983, I had sent two students, Frank Cipriano and Mark Weber. Well, they had really sent themselves, but we had organized a project for them to study dusky dolphins in New Zealand, where it looked like they were doing very similar things. And once Frank and Mark and then Mel and I got there, we realized that they were doing very different things in the deep waters of the Kaikoura Canyon of New Zealand. And that's a project that we've kept up and where we're still working, and where many, many students have, about 20 students in total have gotten their master's or their PhD degrees. And Mel and I edited a book on that called The Dusky Dolphin in 2010. So that's been sort of a labor of love to continue with the dusky dolphins of Argentina, and then the dusky dolphins in several different habitats where they behave similarly in deep water, in shallow water, to the ones in Argentina, and where they behave very differently in very deep water in the Kaikoura Canyon area of New Zealand. In between, in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, I spent a lot of time. I spent 22 summers in total with working with bowhead whales in the Arctic, and that was almost all from circling aircraft, and it was wonderful because we learned a lot about the behavior of mothers and calves and foraging strategies of bowhead whales in the Beaufort Sea of the Arctic. And then I had students in the Amazon studying river dolphins, Amazon river dolphins, or boto, or bufeo, it depends on where you are, what you call them, or pink river dolphins. And also in the early 1990s, we started a project on Indo-Pacific humpback dolphins in Hong Kong, relative to the amazing industrial activity that goes on in Hong Kong. And that's still going on today. And I'm still involved there with a team, with a Hong Kong team of researchers whom we visit. We were going to be there last week, Tom Jefferson and I, but of course that was canceled due to the COVID situation. And we tried to visit at least for some good time with our team members there once a year these days. But that continues. And there are lots of places where I wish we could have done comparative work, such as in South Africa, or with some other animals elsewhere, and that just haven't happened. So even though Melany and I, and sometimes I and my students, have been around in quite a few different places, there's so much more that needs to be done. And now with the new capabilities of electronics, of rapid and efficient photography and videography, and of course with the capabilities, the multi-capabilities of drones, it is indeed another very, very exciting time. So young folks, there's been quite a bit done. We don't know terribly much yet, and you will learn so much more.
For sure. I have two more questions, Bernard. One is more personal, if that's okay.
Oh, sure.
So, one is, who were the people that influenced you in the past and that still influences you nowadays? So, yeah, who were they?
Yeah. We already mentioned two of them,
Yeah.
and the main influencers, and those were Roger Payne,
Right.
very, very brilliant, wonderful person in the field and out of the field. Wonderful, wonderful writing, by the way. He wrote a book in 1995 called, what is that book called? On whales. It is called, my goodness, I need to look here. That's embarrassing. How could I forget that? You'll have to wipe that out of the video. Of God, out of the
I will. That's okay.
but whales. Anyway, he wrote a beautiful book in 1995 describing his life with whales, with a lot of thoughts about his early influences and his capability of, and he does that. He writes about that, and very nicely, actually, of helping to stop large-scale whaling. You know, back when we were watching whales and dolphins in the early 1970s, there was still large-scale factory ship whaling, killing of whaling, especially in the Indian Ocean and the Southern Hemisphere in general, going on by several countries. And not until the so-called whaling moratorium of 1986 did that stop finally. Although there's still some whaling going on, as you probably know, as many of you know, by indigenous people, Alaskan Inuvialuit people, so-called Eskimos, are still hunting a few bowhead whales, but then also by factory ship whaling from Japan and a bit Norway and Iceland. So there are still some sort of problem areas. Although I think the indigenous whaling that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years is well controlled and is arguably certainly not horrible. It's a cultural thing. Except the whale that is killed would think it would be horrible indeed. Roger Payne and Ken Norris. Ken Norris, oh my goodness, he's the fellow who discovered that dolphins can hear echolocation clicks and discriminate them with their jaws, with their left and right sides of their jaws. And he developed that beautifully and had many other wonderful ideas. Back to Roger Payne, by the way, very quickly, he's the guy who also discovered, along with his then wife Katie Payne, that humpback whales sing, right? Those beautiful long songs that are indeed songs by proper definition of repeatability of songs. And now we know that blue whales sing, and that bowhead whales sing, and that fin whales sing in various different ways. But the humpback whales are still the champions of the singers, and Roger Payne discovered that. Roger Payne, Ken Norris, wonderful, I'll call them fathers of, or parents of marine mammalogy in nature. And then there's a fellow whom you may not know as well. He was my PhD advisor, Charlie Walcott. He's done beautiful work with loons, with communication on loons, with the loon bird, with navigation of pigeons, and with various other things. He's still active. He's an emeritus professor at Cornell University, and he was the head of our department and my major advisor at Stony Brook University back in the 1970s. Brilliant, brilliant guy, and also an amazing human being who would help a student wonderfully through all of the problems that students bring upon themselves and that are foisted upon them. And Charlie was always there for me and for many others. So he was kind of a hero who I hope helped guide me as an educator, as a professor in my own endeavors. But I didn't do it well as well. Those three. And the fourth. There's a fourth.
Oh,
who's
yeah?
actually, there's a fourth, and she's actually the first, and that's my wife, Melany.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
For sure.
She's been right there, direct with early work in Argentina and in Hawaii and in New Zealand, and so much as well with editing and helping with the analysis and writing of papers, of things, and whether we did that together as a publication or she was in the scenes there helping with various ways, she was always there and is still always there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm sure the four of them did an amazing job in still doing that. But so are you, Bernard. And obviously I can't thank you enough for all the support, the help, the teaching, the patience. Of course, you've done a lot for me, particularly, and also for all your students. And we, sort of in the name of all them, I think I can say thank you to you, a big thank you.
You're so kind.
For sure, you are one of the persons that inspired me. So thank you so much for that and for lifetime work.
It's kind of self-serving because we see somebody, I see somebody like you who is now a wonderful scientist, wonderful naturalist, and wonderful educator who affects so many other people, and not just in Portugal, but throughout the world. And that kind of influence, feeds right back, and one feels very good. One feels very fuzzy inside for that. And that brings up another sort of major topic, and we sort of often just give lip service to it, but I think educators on the ground like you are very well aware of it, that our research needs to be, yes, it's exciting. It's exciting to learn that humpback whales sing, and that bottlenose dolphin social organization can be described because we can identify them, and that we can look at movement patterns from tiny little radio tags, or from, better yet, from theodolite. It's from shore. That's all good, but we have to do that, and we realize now more than ever that we have to do that in light of the problems to the oceans, the problems to nature in general, and the problems to many populations and species of those animals that we so love. And most of those problems we have caused, we humans have caused, and we need to know enough about the animals in order to know their problems, but also attempt to educate others, especially the young, I think, to do better than we have, to try to stem so many of those environmental problems and to reverse as many as possible. So it's not just, I'm not just trying to say this because everybody says it, but we have to be intricately involved in helping to bring those problems to light, and to again try to come up with ideas of how to help. I think of the baiji, the Chinese river dolphin, that is the first species of marine mammal in our time that has been that is gone, that has become extinct. And in that case, the baiji river dolphin is not just a population, not just a species, not just a genus, but an entire family of dolphin that is gone. That was the last one in the Yangtze River. And it died out because of amazing overuse. Nobody can be blamed except humanity. Amazing overuse of the river, of wiping out food fish, of noise pollution, of pollution in general, chemical pollution, and especially the final death knell to these animals was a type of rolling hook fishing, it's called, that entangled the animals, and they couldn't get up to the surface to breathe, and they died out one by one by one by one in about 25 years or so in very cataclysmic fashion. And there were valiant attempts to save them. There were valiant attempts at trying to get rid of rolling hook fishing that did not make it. And you know, we sort of know why, but again, no one entity can be blamed really there. And the animals are gone. And we could have done better as a Chinese society, as an international conservation society, in saving at least some pockets of those animals for the future and for them, but we didn't, and we must learn from those kind of things. The next animal, I know many of you know, is the vaquita, the Gulf of California harbor porpoise that lives in the northern part of the Sea of Cortez, or the Gulf of California. It's a porpoise, and it is being wiped out by illegal fishing for a particular type of fish, the totoaba, a sea bass, that is prized for its body parts in Asia, and that's now become a giant underground illegal racket, a big money-making affair, where people who try to intervene to stop that kind of fishing are killed at times. So it seems like again, we're for the Baiji in China, it was the rolling hook fishing. For these little guys that are now just a few dozen left, it is that illegal gillnet set fishing that entangles them. It seems like those kind of things could be stopped, but we don't have the national or international capabilities at this point to stop those kind of often, well, environmental degradation in the first case, and rogue problems in the second case. We've got to do better, and with knowledge. And we don't need terribly much more knowledge. We don't need another, 5 years of studying them in order to act. We should be able to do better from both a grounds up type of level and from governmental and intergovernmental action. And so far we've failed. And maybe the more we can bring that up to people, the more knowledge we can help to disseminate on these problems, the hopefully better we will be in stemming another one.
For sure. Yeah, no, for sure. The vaquita nowadays, it's a big concern, and hopefully we'll do better than we did with the Baiji. Hopefully.
Yeah, there's still some hope there. Yes, there's still some hope. Not much at this point, but hope, and we've got to have hope, and not just hope, but concerted action and pressure behind that. I know I and others have been part of trying to pressure the international community, for one, and the government of Mexico through very firm, strong, multi-signed letters from the Society for Marine Mammalogy.
Right.
Those things can do some good, I think, if there's enough pressure. But again, if there's so much other money or illegal money on the other side, it may be difficult. Yeah. These are spot problems. The big problem is, of course, and I think most of you will agree, is rapid climate degradation, is rapid, what we call climate change, and it is that, but it's mainly the world heating up and ocean acidification as a result, and these amazing spawning areas of large coral beds dying out. That's the worst, and that's a big and it seems like intractable problem, and it needs governmental action and intergovernmental, international action, and so many countries are on board and are trying to do their best, which is maybe not all that is needed. Then a few other countries, especially our most powerful country, our powerful country here of the US, is not doing a very good job of that at all at the time. It's embarrassing and it's wrong that we are not helping to be in the lead of stemming climate change. And we could be. We know the problem and we know how to solve it. And we know how to get weaned off fossil fuels. And it turns out that by just about any measures of economic and social action, it is cheaper. It is certainly better, but also cheaper, more economical to go to sustainable energy resources, to go to wind action and water action and especially solar. A type of energy acquisition instead of burning more and more fossil fuels. So we know that, and we know some of the solutions, and we may as well. I agree with you, Joanna, that there may be hope there too, because the young again may do better than we have, and maybe we still have a small window opening of time in order to stem and then hopefully to reverse the damage that we've done on the large scale.
Let's hope so. There's a lot of young people willing to work on all those topics and try to do our best. So let's hope we can certainly make a little bit of a difference.
Yeah, I certainly personally apologize to everybody, that I didn't see that earlier and wasn't more involved earlier on in trying to help.
Oh, come on, Bernard, you've done so much. We all need
on the research end, but not on the direct conservation end that is so very important.
It is indeed, it is. Okay, Bernard, thank you so much. I don't want to take a lot of your time, already did, but thank you so much. I'm sure everybody's going to enjoy this. And of course, thank you for your life work, for all the support, and for being a really good friend, a really good colleague, but most of all, a really good friend. So,
thank you, Joanna, and thank you for asking me to do this, for allowing this. So it is much appreciated, and it's much appreciated to just chat. Thank you.
That's true. It's always a pleasure.